With the release of Phyrexia All Will Be One, we get over 50 cards that give you the ability to proliferate, where you can increase the number of counters on a player or permanent. So let's have a look at some interesting counters that we're able to proliferate, apart from the obvious ones that come out with the new set. Welcome back to Game School Dad with me, Martin. We're having a look at cards we can manipulate that have different types of counters on. So in the Phyrexia set, we are getting oil counters, and we're getting planeswalkers with their loyalty counters, and we are also getting poison counters. So whenever we proliferate, we can add more loyalty counters onto planeswalkers, poison counters onto players, or oil counters onto those permanents as well. But proliferate also works with any other counter that we could have on a permanent or player. Let's have a look at what standard counters there are in the other sets from Midnight Hunt up to Brothers War. See how proliferate might affect these cards. So I've organized these cards into the colors. These are all the other standard cards that have some kind of counter on them. If I've missed any, let me know in the comments below, but I don't think I have. Okay, so starting off with Intrepid Adversary, when we put this out, we can add Valor counters to Intrepid Adversary, which give all our other creatures +1/+1 for each Valor counter we have. So you have a big board of white creatures, you put out Intrepid Adversary, even with one Valor counter on it, everything gets +1/+1. If we proliferate, we're kind of just adding +1/+1 counters onto everything else in a way, because the extra Valor counter will give everything else +1/+1 again. So not too different to just adding +1/+1 counters on everything, but you don't need to have counters on them for this to work. So even if nothing else has a counter on Intrepid Adversary, you can proliferate and add more Valor counters and your whole team gets boosted. We have Stall for Time, which adds stun counters onto permanents, which means when they're tapped, they don't untap at the next turn, they just remove one of the stun counters instead. And when the stun counters have run out, then it will untap. So if we proliferate, we can add more stun counters onto the opponent's permanents to keep them stunned for longer, keep them from untapping, effectively disabling their creatures or other permanents for another turn every time we proliferate. Then we have Wedding Announcement, a really popular card that at the end of your turn, you put an invitation counter on Wedding Announcement. And when you get 3 invitation counters on Wedding Announcement, you can transform it to give all your creatures +1/+1. Now you can make more 1/1 white human creature tokens if you don't proliferate and add more invitation counters onto Wedding Announcement. But if you want to rush forward and skip past the tokens and get to giving all your creatures +1/+1, then you can proliferate and add more invitation counters onto Wedding Announcement. We have Faith-Bound Judge, which is a spirit soldier with Defender, where you can add judgment counters onto it. And if it has 3 or more judgment counters, it can attack as though it doesn't have Defender. So it can't attack to start with, but after 3 turns it can attack. If we proliferate, we can speed up that process. And also with Faith-Bound Judge, when it dies and goes to the graveyard, we can bring it back with a disturb cost of 7 mana. It can enchant a player, and we can put judgment counters on the enchantment, the curse that comes out. We attach it to the opponent. So 3 turns later, they will lose the game, because if there are 3 or more judgment counters on Sinner's Judgment, the opponent loses. If we can proliferate, we can speed that up. So we can put out Sinner's Judgment. It would have to start on our next turn, because it needs to have at least 1 judgment counter on it first. And then if we can find a way to proliferate twice, they lose. We have Dapper Shieldmate, or many other new Capenna cards that can add shield counters onto themselves or other creatures. Shield counters will prevent them from being destroyed by damage or destroy effects. They don't prevent it from exile or bounce or other things, but they will protect it from direct damage killing it and from destroy cards like Go for the Throat. So with a shield counter on a creature, we can proliferate and add more shield counters to keep that creature from being destroyed just a bit longer. We have Planeswalkers, of course, with their loyalty counters. When we proliferate, loyalties go up, and it means we can use those abilities of the Planeswalker possibly faster, using those big ultimate abilities, or by increasing things like +1 counters they might put on creatures like the Wandering Emperor does. With Elspeth Resplendent, another Planeswalker from New Capenna, we have loyalty counters, of course, because it's a Planeswalker, but also Elspeth can add +1/+1 counters onto creatures and a counter that gives either flying, first strike, lifelink, or vigilance. And we can proliferate and add more to the loyalty counters on Elspeth. We can proliferate and add more of the +1 counters. If we proliferate with a creature that might have a +1/+1 counter on it, that also has a flying, first strike, lifelink, or vigilance counter, it will get another one of those counters. Now they don't stack, so an extra flying counter is not going to do anything. 2 flying counters isn't better than 1, but there are some times where we might have extra counters that we don't mind removing for different reasons. So, for instance, with Sanctuary Warden, it comes out, it gets a shield counter on it. In fact, it gets 2 shield counters to start with, so we can proliferate and add more shield counters onto Sanctuary Warden. And whenever it attacks, we can remove a counter from a creature or planeswalker that we control to create a 1/1 citizen token and to draw a card. Now, if we're playing some kind of White Angel deck and we happen to have extra flying counters on a creature, so it has 2 flying counters or 3 flying counters instead of just the 1 that Elspeth might put on it, we can use Sanctuary Warden to remove the extra counters that don't do anything for us, and we get free cards. And we get to use Sanctuary Warden's ability just a bit more without taking off +1/+1 counters or shield counters or loyalty counters that we might prefer to keep on our creatures and planeswalkers. That's a selection of the white cards. Now onto the blue ones. We have Soul Cipher board, which I haven't ever seen anyone use too much, but it enters the battlefield with Omen counters on it. You can pay 2 mana and tap Soul Cipher board to look at the top 2 cards of your library and put one of them into your graveyard. And that will remove an Omen counter if a creature card is put into our graveyard through this ability, or if a creature is put into the graveyard using this ability or any other way, a creature dying, we can remove an Omen counter from the Soul Cipher board, and if it has no Omen counters left on it, we transform it into the Cipherbound Spirit, a 3/2 flying creature. With this, obviously we want to try to remove the Omen counters from the Soul Cipher board in order to transform it. So if your opponent has one, you could add more Omen counters onto it to prevent it from transforming. Or I guess if it's our own one, we might want to keep using its ability to put cards into our graveyard. And so if we want to do that, we can add more Omen counters onto our own Soul Cipher board if we want to. We have Involuntary Cooldown, which again is stun counters, much like we had Stall for Time in white. So more stun counters will keep your opponent's permanents out of action for a little bit longer. And Undercover Operative also puts shield counters on things, so very similar to Sanctuary Warden. And Undercover Operative will put shield counters on a creature, just the same as Dapper Shieldmate, Sanctuary Warden, or many other cards from New Capenna. So not much new in the blue ones there. We have a few in black. We have the Heirloom Mirror, which again, I haven't seen much use of, but it does have its own ritual counters. If we pay 1 mana and tap the Heirloom Mirror, we can pay a life, discard a card, we draw a card, and we mill a card. And then we put a ritual counter on the mirror. If it has 3 or more ritual counters on it, we can remove them, transform it, and it becomes the Inherited Fiend, a 4/4 flying creature that can put extra +1 counters on itself. So if we want to transform the Heirloom Mirror into the Inherited Fiend a little bit faster, we can proliferate a couple of times. When we got that first ritual counter on there, we can do it 2 more times. So if we want to transform the Heirloom Mirror into the Inherited Fiend a little bit quicker, we have to get our first ritual counter on the mirror, then we can proliferate and add a second one, and I guess we can't speed it up any faster than that. And I guess we can't speed it up any faster than that because the transformation is part of the ability, so you have to just proliferate to get the second ritual counter, and then we can activate the ability on the next turn to add a third, and if it has 3 or more, it will then transform. We have Biting Palm Ninja from Kamigawa that enters the battlefield with a menace counter on it, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may remove a menace counter, and when you do, the opponent has to reveal their hand and you choose a non-land card and exile it. So if you feel like you might want to exile more cards from your opponent's hand before you do damage with the Biting Palm Ninja, you can proliferate and add an extra menace counter on it. So it will still have menace when it removes the counter and exiles a card from the opponent's hand. And then when you attack again with it, if you do some more combat damage, you can exile another card. So another way to discard extra things or exile things from your opponent's hand if we can proliferate and add some more menace counters. Now this next one's a favourite of mine, Toxrill the Corrosive. We can add slime counters onto our opponent's creatures and give them -1/-1 for each slime counter on them. So if we can proliferate and add extra slime counters onto the opponent's creatures, it's going to increase the rate that they get -1/-1, rather than just once for their turn and once for our turn, which is pretty fast anyway. But if we want to speed things up, we have to remove their creatures a little bit faster, we could proliferate, add more slime counters, which gives them more -1/-1s that stack. And even if the opponent's creatures are indestructible, that -1/-1 stacking up will kill indestructible creatures as well. So it's a great way to remove your opponent's creatures, especially considering there's some indestructible abilities coming out in Phyrexia, as there are in other sets as well. Next, onto the red cards, we have Dragon Spark Reactor that adds charge counters onto itself, and it can do damage equal to the number of charge counters when you pay 4 mana and sacrifice the Dragon Spark Reactor. It can do that damage to a player directly and to one target creature. So we can add more charge counters onto the Dragon Spark Reactor by bringing artifacts into the battlefield, whether that's artifact creatures, normal artifacts by themselves, or things like treasure tokens, blood tokens. All these things will add charge counters onto Dragon Spark Reactor, with the idea that you get enough charge counters on Dragon Spark Reactor, to sacrifice the reactor and maybe do lethal damage to your opponent directly. If we can proliferate, we can speed up the charge counters and get to that point faster, doing the lethal damage, or at least destroying your opponent's biggest creature with maybe 10 damage directly to it. We have Flame Channeler, a 2/2 wizard creature. When we do damage with a spell, we can transform Flame Channeler into the embodiment of flame, and then our damage spells will put flame counters onto embodiment of flame. And then our damage spells will add flame counters onto our creature. We can remove a flame counter from the embodiment of flame to exile top card from our library, and we can play that card on this turn. So if we can add more flame counters onto the embodiment of flame, so we can add more flame counters by doing more direct damage spells, or by proliferating. Either way, we get more flame counters. It means that we can exile more cards and play more cards from the top of our library. Then Smoldering Egg is a 0/4 dragon egg creature that gains ember counters whenever we cast spells equal to the amount of mana we spent to cast the spell. So if we cast a Play with Fire, we add 1 ember counter onto Smoldering Egg. If we cast Invoke Despair, we add 5 counters. And if we cast a spell that proliferates, we add the amount of mana that we have spent on that proliferate spell, and then we can add an extra ember counter onto it as well. And if we get 7 or more ember counters on Smoldering Egg, it transforms into Ashmouth Dragon, which can be a pretty dangerous card once it gets there. So one of the weaknesses, but it's slightly weak when it's the egg, there's a good chance it can be cut down or removed by something else. So you want to transform Smoldering Egg as quickly as possible into Ashmouth Dragon, and Proliferate might be the way to get it a little bit faster, get to that magic number of 7 ember counters on it. We have Fable of the Mirror Breaker here as an example of sagas. Now lots of different sagas, I haven't included all of them because there's so many, but sagas will progress through the stages using lore counters. So when they are played the first time, you add 1 lore counter, and you activate the first ability. With Fable, it's creating the 2/2 goblin creature. If we then proliferate, we can add an extra lore counter onto Fable, and it can jump up to its second ability straight away. So if you've ever thought that sagas are a little bit slow, you'd like to speed them up, if you can proliferate, you can get them through their stages. And maybe if we can proliferate twice, we can basically get our goblin, fix our cards, and transform Fable into Reflection of Kiki-Jiki all in the same turn. And you can look at all the other saga cards that you have available and see which sagas might benefit the most by proliferating and moving through the stages quicker. But there's a lot of them to go through, so I'm going to keep moving on to Geist Flame Reservoir. This is another artifact that uses charge counters, just like Dragon Spark Reactor. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you add a charge counter onto the reservoir. And just like Dragon Spark Reactor, you can use its ability to deal a certain amount of damage to any target based on the number of charge counters you have. So the more charge counters we can get on with proliferating, the more damage Geist Flame Reservoir is going to do. And then we have Glittering Stockpile from New Capenna, where we add a stash counter onto Glittering Stockpile every turn when we tap it to add red mana. And then when we want to cash in our stockpile, we can sacrifice it and add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of stash counters that we have. So if we can proliferate and add more stash counters quickly, we can effectively ramp up and cast a really big spell a little bit earlier than we could otherwise. Moving on to green, there's only one card I found with a different type of counter on it, and that's the Kappa Tech Wrecker from Kamigawa that can enter the battlefield with death touch counters on it. And when this creature deals damage to the opponent, you can remove a death touch counter and exile a target artifact or enchantment that the player controls. So if we can add more death touch counters by proliferating, we can exile more artifacts or enchantments that our opponent controls, which definitely sounds like fun. So that's all the 5 main colours, and then we have our colourless cards, including some lands, starting off with Hostile, which allows us to sacrifice a creature and put a soul counter onto Hostile, and if there are 3 or more soul counters on it, we can remove them, transform it, and it suddenly becomes the Creeping Inn. So by proliferating, we can get the Hostile to transform a little bit earlier, and we can give ourselves a 3/7 creature that can phase itself out and can drain the opponent's life and give us some life back when it exiles creatures out of our graveyard. And the next one from Brothers War, we have the Blast Zone land card, where we put charge counters on it, and we can sacrifice the Blast Zone to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So it takes us a few turns to build up those counters. If the opponent has lots of creatures that are all mana value 4 for some reason, we can get there faster, get the Blast Zone up to a bigger blast, and then sacrifice it and destroy all of those 4 mana creatures. And we can do that straight away with Blast Zone because it enters with a charge counter on it. We don't have to activate to add the first one. We can put out Blast Zone, we can proliferate straight away, and suddenly we have 2 charge counters on it as soon as we put it out. So possibly a useful board wipe, although kind of limited, but still could come in handy against some of those decks with all creatures of the same size. So a nice kind of board wipe mechanic there as well. The next card I have is Investigator's Journal. Now I haven't seen many people use this one, but Investigator's Journal will enter with a number of suspect counters on it, equal to the greatest number of creatures a player controls. So however many creatures there are out, how many suspects we have, and we can remove a suspect counter from the journal to draw a card for 2 mana and tapping the journal. And then I guess once we've run out of suspect counters, we can just pay 2 mana to sacrifice the journal and draw a card. Now if we can add more suspect counters onto Investigator's Journal, we can keep drawing cards for 2 mana at a time. And because this is an activated ability, we could use those 2 mana, we could get those 2 mana from Power Stone tokens, for example. So maybe a good use for Power Stone tokens to keep drawing things, and Proliferate to just keep it going. Then we have Reckoner Bankbuster, a very popular card, which enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters. And again, a bit like Investigator's Journal, we can pay 2 mana, we can tap it, we can remove one of the counters, and we can draw a card. And with Bankbuster, when we run out of charge counters, when it's drawn 3 cards for us, it will then create the 1/1 token pilot creature and an extra treasure token. But if we want to keep drawing cards with Reckoner Bankbuster, if we don't want the pilot and we don't need the treasure, we could proliferate and add more charge counters onto Reckoner Bankbuster, and we can just keep drawing cards every turn. Again, possibly using Power Stone tokens or maybe the Might Stone and Weak Stone to provide the 2 mana we need to keep using that ability every turn. Next we have Weatherlight Completed, a legendary artifact vehicle that adds Phyrexia counters onto it whenever a creature you control dies. When it starts adding Phyrexia counters, you can scry 1. If you get 4 or more Phyrexia counters on it, it becomes a creature in addition to its other types, rather than being a vehicle that needs to be crewed, and it doesn't have a crew cost either, so you can't crew it. And when it gets 7 or more Phyrexia counters on it, you can draw a card. Now by the way the card's worded, I don't think proliferating after that will help you draw another card each turn, because the drawing a card is triggered by a creature you control dying, then you add a counter and draw a card. It doesn't say by just adding the counter you get to draw a card, so I guess it can help you get up to 7 counters faster so you can get more value out of Weatherlight Completed, but it won't help you draw more cards after that because you've already got to 7 or more counters and that's the best you can do. Then we have Foreboding Statue, which we can use to tap and provide 1 mana of any colour at the beginning, and we can add an Omen counter onto Foreboding Statue. At the end of our turn, if there are 3 or more omen counters on the statue, we can untap it and transform it into a 5/5 Forsaken Thresher, which can also give us mana at our first main phase before combat, but now it's a pretty decent attacker as well. So if we can get more omen counters on Foreboding Statue using Proliferate, we can transform it into that 5/5 creature a little bit faster, and we don't even have to tap it in order to benefit from the mana it can produce. And then we have a few more multicolored cards here. We have Joyra, Ageless Innovator, who we can tap to add 2 Ingenuity counters onto it, and we can put an artifact card with mana value X or less from our hand onto the battlefield, where X is the number of Ingenuity counters. So if we have some nice big artifact creatures, maybe a portal to Phyrexia, we can speed up the Ingenuity counters that Joyra has and basically cheat out those artifacts a little bit faster. And once you get enough Ingenuity counters on Joyra, you're basically just tapping one creature to put any artifact from your hand out onto the battlefield. So if it is something like Portal to Phyrexia, we're getting a huge amount of value just from tapping a creature, not even paying any mana. Next we have Rizona, Asari Commander, who gets indestructible counters whenever it deals damage to the opponent. And if the opponent deals combat damage to us, then we lose that indestructible counter. But if we proliferate first, and we end up with 2 indestructible counters on it, it will lose 1, but it won't lose the other one. So we'll still retain that indestructible counter if we really want our creature to stay indestructible. And then we have Obscura Ascendancy. Whenever we cast a spell, if its mana value is equal to 1 plus the number of soul counters we have on the enchantment, we can put another soul counter on and create a 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. And if we can get to 5 or more soul counters on Obscura Ascendancy, spirits we control get +3/+3. So if we have some other way of creating spirits, maybe with Teferi, the Planeswalker, adding those vigilant spirits that keep getting +1s on as well, and getting to 5 soul counters on Obscura Ascendancy will give those spirits an extra huge boost. Don't know how much play this gets to see, but it's something else we can do with Proliferate at least. And then we have Edgar, Charmed Groom, another card that I like to play occasionally in my Vampire tribal decks. When Edgar dies, it turns into the coffin and goes to the side as a legendary artifact. And then at the beginning of your turn, you create a 1/1 black and white vampire creature token and you put a bloodline counter on the coffin. If there are 3 or more bloodline counters, you remove them and Edgar comes back as the legendary creature 4/4 that boosts your other vampires. So sometimes you might want to keep the artifact at the side to keep producing those 1/1 vampire creature tokens, or sometimes you might want to bring him back to the battlefield a little bit faster, and Proliferate will help him come back a turn earlier. So that's a quick run through of all the other cards that are currently in standard that provide different types of counters. So if you're planning on using one of those 50+ cards with the ability to proliferate, you might want to consider how adding some of these cards into a proliferate deck might work well together with your proliferate cards, more than just proliferating oil counters and poison counters and loyalty counters. So if I missed anything out, let me know in the comments below. If there's any other cards you think will work really well with Proliferate. I think I've got all of them here. And don't forget you can like this video and subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss out on any future videos. Thanks for watching to the end and I will see you in the next video.